arm is this. Our second arm has dealt with how do we make sure that the state of our infrastructure meets the demands of the 21st century global economy as well. For countries as vast as Canada and as vast as Australia, and in both our countries with our population spread across vast expanses of land, this has provided for us in Australia unique challenges in rolling out the information highway of the 21st century, high-speed broadband. Frankly, the national government in Australia has had to take the lead. Market-based solutions may roll out high-speed broadband in the downtown central business districts of our 6 state capitals. But for the entire cities and for our regional centres right across the country, we've had to create a national broadband network, and we're now rolling out the single biggest capital project that Australia has ever seen. It's a $40 to $50 billion project to deliver 100 megabits per second to 90% of the households and businesses of the country over the next 5 years. And secondly, to also ensure that the remaining 10% have access to 12 megabits per second through either wireless or satellite remote technologies. Why do I emphasise that? If you go to any capital in Asia today, those which you will find it quite rare to find one which is not fully wired to the global communications revolution. You go to downtown Seoul, the internet speed there is massive compared with most capitals in the region. Singapore the same. Chinese centres, I have found, in fact, have faster and more reliable broadband than many that I find in regional Australia. And so the story unfolds across the rest of developing Asia. And I cannot emphasise that more to our friends here in Canada in terms of our ability to compete effectively in what will be an increasingly internet-based set of businesses in the 21st century. This is critical as well. So this type of infrastructure project for us in Australia is proving to be more and more central to our national undertakings. When I look to the future again, there is one other element that needs to be emphasised in what we have sought to do in Australia over the last 20 or 30 years. And that is to have about us significant respect for the high cultures and civilisations of Asia, to cause we Caucasian Australians to learn seriously the languages and cultures of Asia. There is a funny thing about the services-based industry, which you would know, having a large slab of your own economies based on the services sector as well. And that is, these are very people-intensive industries. And if they're very people-intensive industries, guess what? You're going to need to be able to speak to people, talk to people. Think of the sheer phenomenon of the fact that we're going to have 100 million Chinese tourists travelling the world sometime in the next couple of decades. Understand also where they're going to prefer to go. Countries where they are met and greeted in the language that they are familiar with, given that most folks are frankly not going to be competent in English. So therefore, we have embarked upon a national languages program in Australia over the last 30 years, which has not been comprehensively successful, but is nonetheless producing a new generation of Australians who are increasingly studying the languages and cultures of Asia. Recently, the Australian government white paper led by Prime Minister Gillard, called Australia in the Asian Century, identifies our 4 continuing priority Asian languages for the future: Mandarin, Japanese, Indonesian, as well as Hindi. These, for us, underpin what we need to be doing for the future. So when you put those things together, an investment radically in the skills that will be needed for the workforce of the 21st century, given the radical investments in education also occurring across Asia. Secondly, ensuring that you also have high-quality 21st century state-of-the-art infrastructure, including the communications networks of the 21st century. On top of that, having human capital which is comfortable in the language and cultures of a regional economy which will dominate the world over the course of the next 40 years. Those, for us, are the building blocks of how we've tried to engage the Asian opportunities which lie ahead of us. Let me conclude with some observations about some principles that we have learnt through this process. Given the opportunities and challenges we face, and given our own experience in implementing the policy directions which I've just referred to, let me reflect on some of the enduring principles and some of the emerging principles that we have learnt or have sought to learn. Number 1, when we look at what is unfolding across wider Asia, whether it's China, India, Indonesia, the drivers of economic growth globally will be increasingly located in the Asian hemisphere through until 2050. Anyone who assumes anything to the contrary is basing it on data which at present does not exist. And the extraordinary thing about Asia is it is not exclusively a Chinese phenomenon. It is the rest of Asia as well. I look with interest at Shinzo Abe's reform program for the Japanese economy. Quite extraordinary statements as someone who's followed Japan for the better part of the last 20 years on the proposed breakup of Japanese power utilities, which were regarded as heresy only 2 years ago. The ability possibly of Japan to begin to self-regenerate its own economy, which is still the third largest economy in the world. The extraordinary dynamism of Korea. But winding your way around the dial, the emergence of Indonesia. Indonesia is a country of 250 million people with a rising middle class, which has been running for the better part of the last decade, growth in excess of 6.5% on average. This is an emerging major economy, and you roll the clock out again towards the middle of the century and much earlier. It'll be a much larger economy than either Canada or Australia's, and those two economies put together. And then you roll the dial across the rest of Southeast Asia and the other drivers of growth, whether it is Malaysia, whether it is, of course, Singapore, whether it is, of course, also the extraordinary dynamism you find in Vietnam, and the opening at last of the country which remains the most underdeveloped in Asia, namely Myanmar or Burma. And then dialing again around to South Asia and the extraordinary dynamism we see within India. My overall proposition is, according to the data, this is not simply a Chinese phenomenon, it is a pan-Asian phenomenon with multiple national drivers of growth across many sectors. Therefore, in terms of our collective forward planning as sensible and intelligent peoples, it is prudent for us to assume that the bulk of global growth will lie in Asia for the next 40 years. Principle number one. Principle number two is that across this dynamic phenomenon called the Asian Hemisphere and its constituent economies, this will not just represent, as many of us have assumed, a simple continuing demand for energy and raw materials, be they Canadian, be they Australian, be they Brazilian, or be they where from ever else in the world, or from the Gulf. It is a much broader phenomenon than that. The emerging yawning demand for developing Asia is multifaceted. One element of that is the demand across Asia for long-term food security. And not just across Asia, but developing Africa as well, with a population of 1 billion, and elsewhere across the planet. We face the rise in the world's population from 7 billion, where it lies today, to 9 billion by mid-century. We face the rolling impact of climate change. We face, therefore, the contraction of arable lands dedicated to agriculture. We see urban encroachment on those arable lands in places like China. We also see the impact on water supplies because of the impact, again, of climate change. Therefore, for countries like yours and countries like ours, there is a remarkable opportunity for smart agriculture in the future to begin to fill some of the food security deficits we're going to see emerge. And within that, again, it is not just food in quantum. It is food in quality, as you see hundreds of millions of people enter into the global middle class out of the economic revolutions unfolding from China through Indonesia around to India. And within that, again, if you're in China, the demand today for food, not just of good quality, but whose food standards can be guaranteed. China today has one rolling national scandal in terms of inadequate regulation of domestic food standards. And therefore, the premium attached to whether it's powdered milk from Australia or comparable food supplies from elsewhere in the world, where parents can be confident that what's put on the table is entirely safe, provides yet a further market opportunity for the rest of us as well. Also, we should see opportunities arising with the emergence of this middle class across developing Asia for boutique manufacturers of consumer goods and other associated manufacturers, and we should not assume that therefore the sun has set on the capacity for advanced Western economies such as yours and ours to access the new demands of Asia's rising middle class. These will not all be met by the needs, by the supply potential of China's own economy or the domestic economies of the rest of Asia. But the other area which I'd emphasise in particular is the explosion in the services industries. Think this through carefully. When you see the rise of the middle class in China, where are the demand points beginning to emerge? Number one, you are seeing it emerge in terms of the demand for financial services, including in the superannuation retirement income sector. You are beginning to see it emerge in terms of education services, not just delivered internationally by advanced economies and education systems such as yours and ours, but also domestically across Asia as well, as Asian parents want to ensure their kids have a quality and affordable education. Thirdly, a booming industry in China today is the emergence of a privately funded healthcare system and a privately funded health insurance system. Again, these are the normal aspirations of rising middle classes across the world in history, but now we see it made manifest across Asia as well. So it's a cocktail of financial services, education services, health services, environmental services, construction services, architecture and design services, engineering services, where frankly across this entire domain the opportunities are vast.